wonderful to be here, and I'm really pleased to be able to talk with you about this. And it was wonderful to have Ellen and invite me. As some of you may know, I direct a project called Arab Barometer, which does public opinion surveys. We cover the Middle East and North Africa, but we're also sister projects with a number of others that cover Africa, that cover the East Asia, that cover Latin America. So we have spent a lot of time thinking about surveys and how to do these representatively. So I know that this is a general seminar. I want to give you some idea about how to kind of think about these, how to do these, and certainly to go back and forth. So I have a presentation here that I hope you can all see. We can kind of go through. Certainly as we go through, please feel free to stop and ask questions. This is for you. This is for your benefit. So I'm happy to take questions along the way and make this more of a discussion than a lecture. So please do feel free to arrange. So the goal today for me is to first of all present a key overview of topics in survey methodology. And the second is to provide you an introduction to the factors to consider if you are planning for a survey of your own, or if you're using other people's surveys that have been done by others, such as Arab Barometer, to think about the quality, because a lot of surveys exist now. There is a number that exists for the Middle East and North Africa now. There's a number around the world, but these don't necessarily have the same quality and have the same ability to make valid inferences. So with that, it is something that I think is very important to think about as we go through what makes a good survey, how to interpret that, and what does it really mean. So that's what I would like for you to walk away with today. I would also say certainly after this, we're happy to always be a resource, particularly for those of you working on the Middle East, North Africa. If you do have interests or questions in this, we're always available. We have a team of researchers who do this. They're happy to help you think about that, because that is part of what we want to do, is help researchers do better work in the region itself. So let me start off with kind of the most basic is, what is a survey? So a survey is a systematic method for gathering information. It is generally from a sample of entities. Doesn't have to be. There are some things like a census that try to interview everyone, but it is a way to gather information from some group. The purpose is for constructing what we call quantitative descriptors. And it's really the design is to have the attributes be representative of a larger population of which these entities are members. So that's a fairly complicated way of saying what a survey is, and we'll get into more of those details. Those are in your readings. But basically at its core, a survey is just another form of data collection. It varies in some ways from other forms of data collection, because in a way it's not data that already exists. It's something that we're actually generally in an opinion survey trying to collect and in some ways bring together these opinions which aren't necessarily formed in the same way as we would say the number of people in the country, things that are just, we're counting those. So it is a bit of a different form of data collection than some of the others you may have been exposed to in this course. So surveys can be used for a variety of purposes. For example, some of those in the readings you had economic uses. These can be done for measuring unemployment, for consumer confidence, trying to think about the ways that there are many others that are used in the economy. There's also a number of others for health. For example, immunization rates, exercise habits, things that have huge impact on how we think about the health of a person or the health of a country overall. The most common, perhaps, is actually market research, and so this is something that is very important for making money for businesses. Is consumer behavior, satisfaction with services, trying to understand, is there a market? So this is a lot of what dominates the research. In fact, in the countries where we operate, a lot of the companies are actually based as market research. That's a bit challenging because they have different goals. Market research is done a bit differently than what we really do in social science, and some of the goals of those surveys are different. So we can talk about that a bit more in Q&A, but this is a really large segment of what surveys are used for. And finally, it is a smaller part of the whole survey world, but I think it is what we really focus on here, and what I focus on is in the social sciences. And so you can think about this more broadly about who will people vote in elections, who will they vote for, what are the views of government, and also things like cultural norms, views of women, views of religious practice, things like this. So there are a huge number of ways that surveys are used broadly. And so in that sense, surveys do play a core role in gathering scientific knowledge. It is the easiest way, perhaps, to really gain insight into a large group of, in this case, individuals typically, and how they view their world, how they understand their world, what they do. This is a key element to understand as you are working in the social sciences. So just to say a bit about what a typical survey in the social sciences looks like. First, we gather information by asking people questions. This isn't always the case. Sometimes this is observational, looking at what people are doing. There's other ways to do this, but the vast majority, and what we'll focus on today, is gathering information by asking questions directly to respondents. The second piece is that information is collected by having interviewers ask questions and record answers, or asking response to fill out the information on their own. This has a bit of an implication for how the survey goes, because in some cases there is another person or another entity, perhaps a computer, asking a question directly. Other times the respondent fills out this on their own, and you can think about this when you filled out a questionnaire online or something of this nature, that you are doing this on your own. So that is a key difference. And then finally, the other piece is that information tends to be collected only from a subset of the population. It's very, very difficult to do this for the whole population. So what we try and do typically is just take a small subset and then think about how that may generalize or how that may relate to a broader part of the society. So are there any questions at this point? Okay. So if we think about conducting a survey, there's a number of steps that you would first do, or think about how to go about this. And so the first is to clearly state a research question or research objective. There needs to be a point to this. So a lot of times people come to me and say, I want to do a survey on gender. That's not necessarily a way to go about this. It really does require you to think more broadly about what is it that you're trying to do. And then that leads to a lot of what follows. So the second piece would be to identify a target population. Who is it that matters? Who is it that you're trying to interview? Who is it that you want to generalize to? Is it the entire country's population? Is it just people who are engaged in academic studies? Is it some other group of unit or group? And how do you actually think about that? And is that something that you can really measure? And that will also define a lot about how you go about doing the survey. The third is to plan how to contact that target population. This is something that can be very easy or very difficult depending on who that is. And I think in the readings that you did in Groves in chapter 1, they talked a lot about this, about thinking about who is it that you're actually targeting. Is it everyone in the country? Is it just a select group of people? How do you actually think about this? And that really helps think about deciding on the contact modes, deciding on the response mode, and considering non-response issues. That these are all critical elements to think about as you do this. And I'll get more into this as we go through the presentation. This is just to give you an overview of kind of the steps that this takes. And so the next would be to design the survey instrument or the questionnaire. Think about, what do you actually want to ask people in the survey itself? How do you want to go about doing that? And what is it that matters, and thinking through that step. The next pieces would be considering the sample size. This has important implications. If you only interview 2 people, you have very little leverage. If you interview 25,000, it becomes very expensive. So trying to balance the sample size and thinking about what is the right sample for what you need and for the questions that you want to ask. Another piece that I think is often missed, this doesn't apply in all countries. In Sweden, it's something that would be perhaps less important, but elsewhere in a lot of the countries we work in, we do need official approval. We can't just do these surveys without going through some of the official channels to make sure that the survey is done safely and legally. There's also a need to do focus groups and/or pre-testing. So to think about this, you may have a brilliant idea on your questionnaire. You may think that this all works. You go to the focus groups and find people don't interpret the questions or understand them in the ways that you think that they should, or that they think that they would. And so it is necessary at that point to think about this in some slightly different ways. Go back and maybe address the questions. If you've missed something, add some clarification. And so there is a step here that before you really do the full survey, you do need to think about doing this with some test subjects or some test respondents to make sure that you are actually measuring what you think you're measuring. The next step is typically to draw the sample, to think about how you're going to do this, and then actually draw the sample depending on your mode. The next step would be fielding the survey, actually doing the field work, doing the survey, reaching your target sample size, and then after that, aggregating the survey data, putting it all together in one data file, weighting as necessary, analyzing the results, considering the margin of error, considering the bias from non-response, thinking about some of these key elements, and finally sharing the survey results, whether it be with the academic community, whether it be with the policy community, whatever that is. So there are a number of steps here. I won't focus on all these as much. I'll basically take us up through the point that we're fielding the survey for the most part in this discussion. There are a number of people who've actually drawn this out. So just to give you a sense, I mean, here's a very simple piece that basically goes through this and thinking about defining the research objectives. It essentially walks through this this different set, the different pieces that I just walked through. And so this is kind of the simplest piece. And so there are models that have this, but there are also significantly more complicated ones. I mean, here's one from Fritz Schuren, who was the head of the American Statistical Association for some time. And he basically goes through and has all these different boxes. I mean, in theory, this is actually what I don't want to go through each of these, but I am emphasizing this is a very complex set of considerations as you're going through the survey, trying to actually create this and do this. This is not a very simple process. So it is something that if you are doing your own, you need to think about, or if you are looking at someone else's, there are questions here that you can think about asking. So certainly we basically go through each of these steps before we field and then eventually deliver the Arab Barometer. So this isn't something that's simple that can be just gone over in 1 hour, but something that really requires a lot of work. So let me continue with thinking about the research design and the sampling procedures. And so this is really a key piece of what makes a survey either a higher quality or lower quality survey in general. And so a key question for consideration is the considerations for research question best answered by survey research. So not all questions can be answered. If you want to compare something like nuclear deterrence between US and Russia, this isn't a good question for a survey necessarily. This is something that has two cases. It's institutional actors. This isn't something that you'd want to think about for that, for example. So there are large and versus small in considerations. If you have only 30 people, you could potentially do a survey, but at that point, it might be something to be better answered qualitatively using in-depth interviews, other procedures. So really, it is something that tends to be a large N question, something that you need a huge number. It's perhaps a conditional relationship, something of that nature. The second is that it can be measured, and that may be something that seems kind of basic, but it is something that you need to be able to find a way to measure this concept in an environment where you are asking opinions of a huge number of people. That it's not something that that can just be taken for granted. It is a concept that being clear and has some sense of the research design thought about and how you will measure this. It generally also helps to have a broader importance, that there's a lot of questions that have huge importance, but isn't something necessarily that is of importance to the general public. The general public doesn't really know much about it, or the population that you're looking at doesn't have a good sense of the questions. It is harder to actually conduct a survey in this way. So it generally helps to have something that is of broader importance or something that people know about, not something very, very niche. Often it helps to test a theory or hypothesis. This doesn't always have to be the case, but generally having some belief about how the relationships will function in the survey is generally useful because that does help inform how you go about this. And then finally, it's factual versus attitudinal. Most of the surveys in the social sciences are attitudinal. There are some factual elements, but asking people if they know X or Y, it can perhaps fit into a model. But generally, it's better to think about things that people hold as attitudes or how they actually interact. And so you do want to think about, is this really the right place to measure or address the research question based on some of these factors? The second step, as I said before, is really identifying the target population. So there is a key piece here of who should be included. So you could include everyone, but generally there's only some groups that you want. So for instance, I've been working on a paper that is thinking about the relationship that's been longstanding about Islam and democracy. That there's a question: are Muslims less or more tolerant of democracy? There's an early literature that said it wasn't necessarily. So in that case, we are doing public opinion surveys in the Middle East and North Africa. There are Christian populations, there's others. If we were really just focusing on this question only, we would only want to include the Muslim population, not necessarily others as well. So in that case, it is important to think about who should be excluded. In this case, in this research example, it would potentially be Christians, it'd be people who don't consider themselves Muslim in these societies. There is also a challenge of who or what should be included that cannot feasibly be included in a survey. So for example, if we're doing surveys in Lebanon and we're going door to door to ask people, we can't necessarily ask the diaspora. People may be Lebanese who are working in the Gulf, they may be working in Europe, they may be in other places. We can't necessarily include them if we go about this. And so they should be included. They may be citizens of Lebanon, but they can't really be feasibly if we design the survey in this way. So it is important to think about those groups that may want to be in, but you can't actually include in the survey. And finally, who should be excluded that cannot necessarily be excluded. I mean, there was a case of a survey that was done of, for example, by the Pew Research Center, where they did a study of the Jewish population in America. What they found as they went through the survey, there were a number of people who said they were Jewish, even though they weren't ethnically Jewish and they were not religiously Jewish. What they found is that there were people who said they followed Jesus, who, since he was Jewish and himself, according to their interpretation of it, they were themselves Jewish as well. And so these are people who shouldn't really have been included in the survey, but a third of the people identified themselves that way. So it is also thinking about who may tell you that they should be in the survey if you go through this, but really can't be excluded, and how that may influence it. So in the case, the Pew Research Center had to include a much larger sample of people, because there were people who kept selecting into the survey that was only for the Jewish population of America, because they identified in a way that really the authors of the report didn't think that they should be. So it is important to think about the target population and how this actually can function. Any questions here? Sorry, I heard something. Okay. So to think a bit more about sampling approaches, the goal of the survey is to make the best inference possible from the sample that also has to take into account budget constraints. Ideally, we would have unlimited budget constraints, but we don't. So there are these issues that we have to face. And particularly if you're a researcher doing this on your own, looking for funding, this is important to think about. So there are the questions that come with the budget constraints, but within the budget you have, the question would be, what is the best method given the research question? If you want to think about a question about how does online behavior vary, or how does being online change people's behavior, it doesn't make sense to do this as an online survey. You have to have people who are not online, which would lead to some other form. So there are elements of this that have to think about what is the best method given the research question. The second is, what does the selected method mean for accuracy? So basically, how do you answer the question, who is it that, again, is included, excluded? What is the biases that come from this? And that is a really key piece of the survey process, of thinking through, if you are not getting certain groups of population, if you have a survey that is self-administered, people have to potentially read it, you won't necessarily have people who are illiterate. If that matters for your survey, then it is something that you need to think about a different way to approach it. So there are these key pieces of thinking about the survey method. There's also a question about, what does the selected survey mean for the total cost? It may be that you need to change your sample size. If you really need to do this in person, which tends to be more costly, it is something that you can think about decreasing the sample size. Maybe that's the best approach. Maybe it's taking part in a group survey where there's other topics on it. There's different ways to think about this, but it is something that there are real costs to how you think about the survey and the mode. And then finally, are there other resources or approaches that could help you gain additional leverage? So sometimes you may want to do a very small survey that can help you show some of the mechanisms, other things, and then generalize that to a larger survey. Projects like Arab Barometer, our sister projects, the World Value Survey, others have data that's available online that can help you gain leverage. Maybe you do this in one country and then use those data sets to try and generalize it to a broader set of countries. There are different approaches that can be made to help you think about how to gain additional leverage. I think that the most important part of thinking about surveys and how we actually go about these is what is termed representative or probability-based sampling. So representative samples, one possesses the same attributes and orientations as the larger population from which it has been drawn. So basically what this involves is trying to take a large population, say in this case, the entire country, and drawing a sample or a subset of people from it that really look like the population overall. So the way that we've done this, and this has been drawn out, you saw this in the readings, is that it typically involves the use of probability-based or random procedures to select who is included in the sample itself. What this means is that each respondent has a known, calculable, and non-zero probability of selection. So let's walk through this for a moment. So each respondent, we can calculate through some basis how the degree to which the likelihood of them being in the sample, but also that they have a chance. So even if you have a population of 100 million people, you only have a sample of 1,000 people, we know that the chance of each of those people of actually being in, and that for that whole population of 100 million, each of those people has a chance of actually being included in the survey. So these are the key. This is the key piece of thinking about the quality of a representative sample, is being able to calculate each of these. The second piece is that generally the probability of selection for a single individual into the survey is approximately equal, but it can be unequal. Are there some places that you can think of where we might want it not to be equal across respondents? This is a question for you all if you have any thoughts there. Is there a time that we might want certain people to be more likely to be selected as opposed to others into a survey?
If I understood your question correctly, you're asking that if there is a particular group that we decide earlier that we need to select them, right?
Exactly. So, for example, if you were studying the United States population and you wanted to be able to make inferences about the African American community, they're only about 10% of the population, but you may want them to be half of the sample. So in this case, you might want a differential probability of selection, or if you wanted to compare, just one region of the country, you wanted to get more people from Texas for some reason because you thought Texas was different than the rest of the country, you may include more people from Texas in your sample. And as a result, the probabilities of selection are unequal, which is okay. I mean, that doesn't mean that you can't generalize the population by weighting and other things, but there are times that you may want to increase the probability of certain people to be in the survey. So another piece of another key piece of the random sampleability is to not choose, as respondents do not choose to be in the sample, but they're intentionally selected. So this means that we are picking the respondents either through various methods, but that they can't just volunteer. We can't have somebody say, oh, I heard you're doing this really interesting survey. Can I take part? They can't join the survey without being selected by you through the sampling procedure. So this process is very important because it means basically you're controlling who's in. You aren't just choosing people who are volunteering or want to be in, but it is drawing a sample that's designed to represent the population. So what that leads to is the ability to calculate a margin of error. There's a known likelihood in the sample that it will match the target population. So you may have seen this in surveys, the margin of error, the number of people who, or the percentage, the plus or minus 2 or 3 points is the estimate. So that basically means that if you drew the sample over and over again and performed the survey over and again, 19 out of 20 times, the results would fall within the same range as that plus or minus 2 or 3 points from the point estimate. So if 50% of people say they're voting for Donald Trump for president, you would find that if you did that 19 out of 20 times, that it would be between 48 and 52% if the survey is well done. So this is a really key piece of sampling for what we do. There are a number of different ways to do this, and I want to just make sure that this is something that is understood. So the first is what we call area probability sampling. This is one of the earliest ways that people drew the samples. And so you can think about this. There are some examples about different types of samples, about potentially crops, about dividing areas and taking certain areas of the land to think about what people are planting in the readings you did. But for the social sciences, we do this a bit differently. What we do is we take the countries. So let's say we take a country and divide it into states or governorates. So the largest administrative unit. We often use stratification. So in this case, in the United States, we'd give more interviews to California, Texas, and Florida, and very few to places like Vermont and Delaware. So basically, we divide the country into different units, and then allocate the sample representative of that. So in California, about 1 out of every, say, 10 people in the United States lives in California. They'd get 10% of the interviews. In a place like Vermont, only about 1 in 100 live there, say, so they would get 1 out of 100 interviews that we're doing in the sample. So it is trying to allocate the sample to match the population. Within each of these, we'd randomly select a district, so smaller unit within each of the governorates or the states or something of this nature. We would do that if we had information to try and, again, allocate the interviews to where more people live and fewer to where fewer people live by probability of them living there. This is what we call probability proportion to size, or PPS sampling. Basically, a large county like Los Angeles County, which has a huge number of people, would get a much greater likelihood of selection than a small county that has only, say, 500 people living in the US. So there is an attempt to still select with the likelihood that we know of where people live. Eventually, we'd reach something smaller like blocks or census tracts. In this case, we don't necessarily have information, or they're approximately the same size. And we'd use what we call simple random sampling, or SRS, to select those just at random. We assign interviews to each of those. And in this case, we generally do 8 in the Arab Barometer. Other people may do different numbers there. We go to houses within each, we randomly select the number of houses within each of these small clusters, and then we randomly select a respondent with each household. The key piece is that each of these steps, there is a random probability of selection. That's the most important piece. And so if you are looking at a survey that tries to do this type of sampling, the key question for the researcher is, did they always use a random selection process, or did they choose different ones at different points? A second type of sampling that's newer now is coming in vogue, you may hear about, is grid sampling. This is a process that uses mapping software, computers, to divide geographic area into units. It's essentially like what you heard in the readings about choosing randomly different areas of the planter's fields, or the farmer's fields in this case. You randomly select between these units. This can be done based on profiles of these units, such as some are urban, some are rural, some are their likely population estimates from the computer. You randomly, again, select the grids. This can be done using stratification. It can be done a number of different ways. There's different approaches to grid sampling. And then again, you randomly select houses or all the selected grids, and you randomly select a respondent with each household. So this is another process of random sampling that can be used and is becoming more common now, and you may hear about if you're looking at surveys. A final type, which is actually very common in the US or Europe particularly, is what we call random digit dialing, or RDD. This is where phone numbers are randomly selected from a universe of known phone combinations. Basically, any possible code is, in theory, selected and put into a computer that then randomly draws these. They call a number. The person who, in theory, picks up the phone is then asked the questionnaire, or they're actually asked, is this number shared? For if it's a landline, if it's where multiple people may live, it is then trying to randomly select an individual within the household. So again, this is an entirely random process. People can't choose to be part of the survey, but it is another way that people have done representative sampling using phones. There are, of course, ways to do non-representative sampling, and these are actually very common. You can actually see a number of examples of this as you look around. So it is something to really know about the difference on. So one is that the key of non-representative sampling, if each respondent does not have a known or calculable probability of selection. So the result of that is it's not possible to generalize the findings to a broader population in a scientific way, or at least in the same manner. In effect, you cannot also calculate a margin of error. We don't know the likelihood of a person being in or out, and how that could, again, generalize the broader population. So you may see, on some of these, you may see this reported, but from a probability-based design, you can't actually calculate a margin of error in the formal ways. People have tried to work around this, but there are some issues with that, because again, all of this is based on the probability of selection model, or the representative sample. The main reason people use these, they tend to be far, far less expensive than the probability-based samples. It is very, very expensive to do a probability-based sample in the typical manner. However, that said, these are often fully compatible with the goals of your research questions. This is not to say do not use these, or these are bad surveys. It just is a different process and a different goal. So to give you a set of examples of what non-representative sampling may represent, there is convenience sampling. So this is a selection based on those who are easily accessible. It might be one of the common ways is that if a college professor is looking for people to participate in some type of experiment, he or she will ask students in their class to come in and actually just take the survey, force them to do it. It's an easy sample, they're easily accessible, and it's something that can be easily done and drawn quickly. Another is purposive sampling. So it's selecting respondents based on a researcher's own judgment when choosing the population to participate in the survey. Can you think of an example of where we might want to use purposive sampling? Sure.
For me, purposive sampling, I would choose, let's say that I'm doing research to understand the factors that allowed girls to join undergraduate studies, and those girls who are not able to join the graduate studies. So for that, I would go and select that area where the society itself does not encourage girls' education, and those are like unique sample of girls who made it into college.
So that's a good example. Other examples you may want to think about it if you want to do an elite survey, so a survey of political elites. It's not clearly defined necessarily who are political elites. You can think about who those are, you can find them, but it isn't something that there is a agreed upon sample of elites. There's attempts to do that, but you can think about, I want people who have run for Congress. You won't necessarily get a universal sample of those, but you can use this in ways that Abdulrahman mentioned. There's other purposes for this. So it is an important way to think about. There's also what we call referral, or more commonly snowball sampling. So it's selection of a study based on recruiting new subjects from those among their acquaintances. So basically, if, for example, I want to find people who, and let's go with Abdulrahman's example, I want to find people who've been discouraged from going to university, girls who've been discouraged from going to university. I might ask them, do you have friends who have also had this issue? So it is something that they can say, oh, yes, I know this. Or if you're thinking about an activist community of people who are protesting the environment, do you have friends who have also done this? Because that group are likely to know each other. You can get a larger sample from this. So it is a valid way to get a larger sample of people who've done some behavior who may know each other. Another option, which is very common, is volunteer sampling. So it's selection based in the study because they volunteer or respond to an advertisement. I'm sure you've all seen these advertisements online of, what do you think about X, so on. Or you may have seen ads around the university or others that ask you to take part in some type of study or survey. So it is just choosing to have people to get a larger sample with people choosing to be in. And finally, there's not finally, but there's others, but another common one is quota sampling, which is a selection based on a non-random selection or predetermined number of or proportion of units. In a less complicated way, that's saying that if Coca-Cola wants to know what do you think about Coca-Cola, they might just hire a firm to say, find us a number of youth and let us know if they have a positive or negative view of Coca-Cola. It is something that is not a random selection necessarily. It's very commonly used in market research where they just want different groups of different backgrounds to be able to compare, do older people or younger people. And it's a cheaper way than doing a representative sample. So it is something that's quite common in places like market research. So what are some uses of non-representative sampling? Can you think about some places this would be really a better way to go for cost considerations than a representative sample?
I'm thinking maybe like small projects, like maybe thesis, like master's thesis or something like that, something that's not too elaborate somehow.
That's a great example. Are there others? So it is really important. I mean, what you're saying there is exactly right, that if you want to show particularly that there's a mechanism, that there's something that may exist, and particularly if you want to generalize this to a broader population, like we talked about before, you could certainly take a small survey, show that there does seem to be a mechanism, and then see if you could use a larger data set to generalize that out more broadly, even if it's not exactly the same question to general out. Another place that's really useful is in experimental designs. So often to do this, you can give two people different questions, and it doesn't matter as long as you've chosen randomly who gets within your sample or tried to balance this in some way. You can basically use experimental design with non-representative samples. That means at the end of the day, you cannot say that all Americans think X because you don't have, or whatever larger group you're thinking about has this view, because you can't generalize it for the reasons we talked about, but it does give you a lot of leverage. If you take a college class, randomly divide half of it into one group, half in the other, give them different treatments or give them different surveys to see how this affects their changes, you can potentially get some evidence of an experimental outcome. Another case that this is important is a study of a rare population. If you have a population that's 0.01% of the overall population, it's really, really difficult and expensive to get that. I mean, if we're going back, I mean, you can, the study of Jewish Americans that the Pew Research Center did, 2% of Americans are really Jewish by their definition, or the definition of the study authors. That's a really expensive question. You're calling people and then you're getting a low response rate on the phone, and only 2% of the people that you actually get through to are likely to fit this population. It's extremely expensive to do this. So they could have potentially considered trying to find other ways to do that to drive down costs. another way that this can matter is in study of change over time. So if you want to go back and ask people the same question over and over again and see, do their views change? I mean, so you're thinking about this in, say, the American elections. Do people change their vote over time, or is it consistent? You may not need a representative sample for that. You may want to start with one, but some people don't respond. It drops out. There's changes in who's in that panel, but it is a key place where you can see changes over time without necessarily having a general, an overall representative sample. And finally, there may be some cases where you don't care about a larger sample. You're not trying to make claims about the United States, about Tunisia, about some larger group. And in that case, this is a much better approach. I mean, this is where market research doesn't really care if they can say what everyone thinks. They just want a cheap and relatively quick sample of what a group of people with a certain demographic think about their background. So they don't care about generalizing that more broadly. So there are cases where this is actually a significantly better approach. However, there is a poor use for non-representative sampling, and you actually will see this. There are a lot of surveys published that do this, is trying to generalize to a larger population scientifically simply by weighting to probability-based designs or others. There are examples where I know people have used our data that we've collected, which is representative probability design-based, tried to weight their data to it from a non-probability-based sample and said, see, now this represents the general population. That really isn't the case. Again, it's important to say what you can and can't do with a survey, to be honest about that. Not to say it's good, bad, or otherwise, but it is something that you want to think about here. And certainly there are surveys that do claim to represent a larger population, but have really not done the background to be able to make that claim. And so it is something you should be more skeptical of as you approach this. So again, there are certain cases where this is actually becoming more common. And so, for example, in the United States, there's been a challenge that most companies cannot reasonably afford to do in-person surveys. Telephone surveys have a very low response rate now in the United States. So there has been a move to create non-probability-based samples. And so you can think about this, particularly some of the online samples such as YouGov in the United States or others are using non-probability-based samples and trying to infer this to the broader public. This is a bit controversial, particularly when it started to come out. It is something that they have done extensive research to try and generate a panel of respondents who they can come to that really does look like the probability sample or what they would yield. They've put in a huge amount of work. This took almost a decade to really be able to do particularly well, but they do draw a sample from a panel and that is specifically weighted to the purpose of doing this. They, in theory, track the responses during the field work to carefully ensure the sample does look like a representative sample. And so you may see some of this. This doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. This is still something in the survey research that's controversial, but it's taken a huge amount of knowledge, a huge amount of surveys comparing to these surveys, and they are becoming reasonably reliable. So it's not to say that you can't do this, but it is something that as either a student yourself or in places that don't have the vast resources in terms of knowledge about public opinion surveys over time, that is in a place like the United States, this would become more difficult. So again, you may see some of these things. It's something that I would be cautious about, but it has become something that is more common in certain environments where it is costly and difficult to do surveys at this point. Any questions on this? Okay, so another key piece is to really think about survey mode. So in this case, there are a number. This really started off, you can see this in your readings, with mail. So the first thing that people did was they mailed out questionnaires. The questionnaire sent to respondents. In theory, the respondents fill out the survey themselves. There's no interviewer involved. The respondents mail it back to the researcher, and the researcher has a large sample. There's a number of benefits to this. The cost is relatively low. There's no researchers. You're paying for the cost of the stamp, which is relatively low per respondent. You have a high degree of respondent privacy. If you want to fill this out and, with no one watching your responses, you have that. And there is ability to target responses geographically. If you just want to do New York City, you can just pick a selection of New York City. You can pick a selection of any place that you want in theory. So there is an ability to geographically concentrate. There are a number of limitations with this, however. There's a very low cooperation rate. There's outdated information on addresses or mailing challenges. Sometimes the post office or the mail carrier doesn't deliver. You don't know that for sure. People may have moved. There's also potential confusion with the respondent providing his or her responses. If the questionnaire is unclear, they don't understand, They may fill it out incorrectly. They may just simply throw it away because they're confused. There's a limited selection over who fills this out within the household. So if you have a household of 10 people, maybe they give it to the 10-year-old who wants to do it as opposed to who they really are targeting. You don't know who's done this really. And there's a limited questionnaire length. People are not going to sit there and fill out a survey for 45 minutes at home. They have other things to do and they can simply throw it away. And there's also a question of how long does the field period last? In the US and places like this, they still try to do this occasionally. It's something that is very uncommon in places that I work because the mail service addresses aren't that well established in certain countries. So it is something that is where a lot of this started, but it's not where people work now. There's the option of phone, which is interviewers or potentially a computer randomly calls respondents, or maybe not randomly, but generally randomly calls respondents. The respondent provides the responses to the interviewer directly or the computer. This has been what's been most common. This is mentioned in your readings, that basically it balances historically the cost versus the coverage. So it's an intermediate cost. It's the simplest process of random selection. You can just draw a random group of phone numbers from all the available phone numbers in a country, call them, and it's a very simple process for random selection, relatively speaking. There's often a live interviewer to assist the respondent if there are questions, to help them understand, to give them the guidance, or to make sure that their fault, that they aren't giving responses that they don't understand, things like this. There's a short field work period. You can do these relatively quickly. Often these take 2 to 3 days to get 1,000 or 1,200 respondents. But there are some limitations as well. I mean, one is phone coverage. There were the graphics in the Groves et al. That talked about how in the United States, once 90% of people had phones, that this has essentially become the dominant mode. This isn't necessarily the case everywhere. We have seen the rise of mobile phones in a number of countries in the Middle East, North Africa, Africa, other places increasing, which has made this more viable. But there's still the question of coverage. There is also the problem of declining contact and response rates. The mobile phones, I don't know if you have this, I don't accept any calls on my phone from a number I don't know. So basically it just sends it to voicemail and I won't necessarily call them back. So it is something that is getting harder and harder. Even if you do reach somebody and people sense it's a telemarketer or it's somebody who is calling them for a survey, they're unlikely to necessarily take that. So at this point, the response rates initially started at almost 50%. And now they've fallen in some cases to 2 or 3% in the United States, which is making this very hard to do. There's also a high break-off rate. If you get bored, if you get a question you don't like, it's very easy to hang up the phone, just simply disappear. So people don't complete the survey. It's very hard to target this geographically now that we have cell phones. People live in different areas from where their area code is in the United States, and places like Jordan, there is no link between a mobile phone number and the place someone lives, so you have no idea where they live. You can't target this geographically particularly well. You also may pick up people who, are abroad. They maybe have a phone. They're traveling. They're in a different country. That's not necessarily who you want, or maybe who you want. But there is an issue of where are people actually based. There's also the question of people having multiple phone lines. So you have a phone in your home, perhaps you have a mobile phone. People can have different numbers here. So there is a challenge here. And there's also limited privacy potentially that in an experiment we've been doing in one of the Middle Eastern countries, people are worried that the government may be listening. It may not be something that people feel that they have privacy to answer securely, depending on the country. So it is a potential issue as well. What I predominantly do in the research I do is in person or face-to-face. This has a number of potentially advantages. This sends interviewers directly to a respondent's home. Somebody's in front of you, they're knocking on the door, they come into your home, or you do it outside, whatever, but you're doing it at someone's home. The respondent provides their answers to the interviewer and they complete the survey. One of the benefits is it's a relatively high response rate. These aren't as high as you might think. In the past, these are much higher. But if someone's at your door, it's much harder to turn them away than it is to simply hang up the phone or to simply throw away the survey if it's mail. It leads to significantly high response rates overall. We can also target geographically. If we want to just do an oversample of a small rural area, we can do that by simply sending more interviews, giving more interviews to that area. We have complete control over geography, basically. We also have an interviewer who can assist the respondent. And this is something that, if you do have someone in doing an interview with you, it's kind of rude to kick them out. So you do get a longer survey instrument. You can ask more questions of people before they get frustrated with doing the survey. So there are some key benefits here. The limitations, of course, are it's very expensive. It's very expensive to send a team of people out across the entire country. Sometimes they have to stay places, get hotels, other places, other things like this to do. It also is a place where deviations from the sampling plan, or what we might call fabrication, tend to be higher. If you're trusting people to go to a certain place, perhaps it's a place that is, very crime-ridden, things like this, they may be less inclined to do that. They may want to go to a safer neighborhood nearby. It may be something where people in the home don't necessarily follow the survey instrument entirely. So there is a higher degree of fabrication by particularly interviewers in this environment. It often actually has the lowest privacy as well, that if you're asking questions about gender, do you think, one of the questions we ask is, should men be the leader of the house? And you're asking to a man in front of his wife or a wife in front of her husband, that does have some potential privacy issues. Or if they fear that that person can hear, there are some. Of course, from the government, this is something that may actually be beneficial, that people can say things in their home that they can't say publicly. And so they may be scared to do this on the phone. So there is a difference in privacy potentially. This tends to be a very long period for field work. To cover the entire country, to do 1,200 interviews or more takes a long time, and often it requires government permission. So none of these are, as you can see, there are benefits and limitations to each of these. The final one, which is very much in vogue now, is the internet. So people are doing these responses over the internet. Respondents are recruited through various approaches. They provide answers online. You may have seen these on Facebook or other places. Maybe you've even done some. The huge benefit is they're relatively inexpensive. It's very cheap to ask people to do this. People perceive they have privacy, even though the government is really tracking a lot of what you're doing online. People don't sense that in the moment. So there is a greater degree of privacy potentially. And they often take a very short fielding period. You can potentially, if you do enough ads across the internet, get responses within a day, say, depending on the question. So there are limitations here. Again, with this approach, it's almost never possible to achieve a representative sample in a true sense. You don't really know, the Facebook surveys, it's only people who are on Facebook, but then who sees it, who doesn't? How do some of these algorithms work? There's really an unknown probability of selection, extremely low response rates, particularly if you're not using an existing panel. It allows us, people I've talked to who do these more routinely, it generally is at most 10 questions. After that, people get bored and want to go back to watching TikTok videos or whatever they're doing, as opposed to taking this. There's very high breakoff rates, and you have no interviewer to assist the respondent in cases where there's some confusion. So there are some downsides to this, but it is certainly the new world that people are really using to do this type of work. There's a few additional considerations. These have kind of come throughout, but you need to think about this in terms of how the interview is done. That the use of interviewers tends to increase the response rate because you are talking to an actual human as opposed to something that you can click off of. The interviewers can also help respondents who don't necessarily understand a question, that there can be clarifying elements. You can get feedback from the interviewers about the questions where people have confusion to help you interpret the results. However, interviewers can also increase the cost dramatically. It is much, much more expensive to hire a large number of people to do this. And they also introduce various biases. Asking certain questions about gender to a man versus a woman leads to different responses. Religious versus not religious looking people can lead to different responses. So there are some challenges here to consider with interviewers. The second is really privacy. Asking people to give their true preferences is something you want to create the greatest degree of privacy you can. So the self-administered surveys where you take the survey yourself on the internet or by mail tend to have the greatest degree of privacy, but the perceived privacy varies depending on the mode and context. So we've done experiments where potentially gender questions are best asked over the phone, where you can only hear yes, I agree, I disagree as a response, whereas other things like about the government may be best at the home, as I was kind of highlighting before. People don't feel the government is necessarily listening in their home, but they may be worried they listen on the phone. And so again, how you think about your mode can differ with how privacy matters and what you think is the best way to go about that. There's also the consideration of coverage. So no mode that I've talked about here offers a perfect coverage, meaning it's important to find the right balance. You may miss people who are expatriates, those who are living in Europe, for example, aren't in our surveys because they're simply not home. They're working abroad. They can't be in our survey, even though they are citizens. Other things, you may, if you want a survey again, if you're doing an internet survey, you won't have people who are not online. And so in a place like Egypt, about half the population is not online. It's not particularly viable to do a nationally representative survey of Egypt right now, at least, using the internet. And there's also non-response a major consideration. And a lot of the Facebook surveys, for example, you're getting response rates of the number of people who see the advertisements, fewer than 1% are clicking on it, and a very small percentage of those are actually taking the survey. You don't really know, did people see the advertisement? Did they not see the advertisement? It's very hard to think about that. There are other issues of non-response. If people are systematically not going to respond, based on what you're doing because they don't trust people, other things like that. You need to think about this because non-response is a significant issue as well. And finally, duration. Lengthy questionnaires do lead to break-offs. People, if you say, I want 45 minutes of your time, I say, oh, that's way too much. I can't give you that. I'll give you 15 minutes. So trying to keep the questionnaire shorter is beneficial. And then also the duration of the field work, that long field periods like what we do can be interrupted by events. I know survey, for example, in Morocco, we had the tragic earthquake that happened there in September. Certain surveys were cut off because of the earthquake and had to stop field work. And so, for example, that can change. Or, we have seen, for example, things happen in the middle of the survey where, and we're in the field in a couple of countries for the Arab Barometer when September 11th happened, when the Arab Spring happened. So in this case, you had major changes taking place, and you can see some differences in how people respond before and after that. That's interesting as a scientist, but it also, having long field periods can be challenging to analyze the data depending on what events happen along the way. We're almost out of time in terms of the hour here, so let me just run through a few things on questionnaire design, and then we can stop and have some Q&A. So for large-end questions, most questions are closed-ended. That means that the respondents have to pick between a set of choices which best reflect their personal view. If no response option closely matches, they may be able to choose other specify. But the goal when you're doing this and drawing these together or examining someone else's closed-ended is to make sure that these options are mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive. So each combination, each set of response should be unique. You shouldn't have something that says, what's the biggest problem facing the country? One could be the economy and the other could be unemployment. Those two are not exclusive. People will confuse those two. So it's not a good approach. But also they should be combined. The responses should cover as much as you can reasonably with the response choices. So in some cases, if you ask what's the biggest challenge facing your country, certain surveys have, say, 32 different items there. Others have 7 that are kind of broader categories, but it is an attempt to try and include all the possible options, so people will do that. There are ordinal questions which have a natural ordering. For example, strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree to some statements. This has led to the development of Likert scales, which typically include an odd number of responses with the category. Their challenge with this is it 5 that should be included. Again, strongly agree, agree, neither agree nor disagree, disagree, or strongly disagree has 5 points. Other people, and generally the literature stopped at 7. Sometimes you go from a scale of 0 to a 10, so there's 11-point scale, but in theory, you could do a 101-point scale. You could do any range, 0 to 100, things like this. There isn't necessarily agreement on this. Generally, 7 tends to be the optimal, or 5. But again, there are some challenges with this, and including, is the difference between agree and strongly agree the same as between agree and neither agree or disagree? As you do analysis, these issues become things. So there's a whole literature on this. I'm not going to go into that today, but it is something to think about in terms of how you design these. There's also what we call nominal questions, which don't have a natural ordering. This could include things like a list of political parties, who do you intend to vote for, or the greatest challenges facing the country. It is challenging to do this within an environment where there are potentially 100 different parties, or there's 100 different challenges. So one of the things people do is include other specifies, so include this, 95% of the options that people might pick for political parties, and if somebody chooses other, they can do that. A challenge with that is respondents are far less likely to choose other than a response option that is directly read out to them. So people assume that the list that you've given them is what you want them to choose from, and relatively few will read that out compared to if that option that they were going to choose is on the list. The other challenge is that response may not provide useful response. So if you say, what is the greatest challenge facing the country? People may say other, and then say the economy and corruption. So that's 2 different options. We don't know which is the biggest challenge. That may be okay, but there are challenges that come from this. so again, there's not a perfect way to ask these questions. And then another is to rank the options on the list instead. So say what is the greatest challenge, and just rank each of the 6 or 5 or 6 options you may have in order of what is the biggest challenges. So again, people may say the economy, and then further down is corruption and all the others. So it is difficult to rank these precisely. And the respondent may have an opinion about an item, may not have an opinion about each item on the list. So again, there are ways to ask these questions, the nominal questions. There's different approaches. You'll see these on surveys. None of these are exactly right. This is always a challenge to include these, but these are what you should look for to do if you're doing it yourself, or if it's a good question to see what others have done, how you would want to evaluate that. There's also numeric questions. These are response categories that are numbers, age, income, number of times you've, say, done a certain behavior. It includes there is a challenge about including exact amounts or ranges. So, for example, if you ask people, what is your income? People often will say, it's $50,000 or something like that. They won't give you an exact number, but if you are asking, we've done this in surveys ourselves, certain people give a higher range, a higher response rate if you actually give them a range, like it's within a certain range, because they may not know their exact income. They may not know exactly how many times they've participated in a protest in the past year, but they do know that it's been more than 5 times. So it is something to think about how you ask this yourself if you're developing this. You may not want to ask for an exact number, but to give a general range based on what would be best for analysis, and also to encourage people to give a sense of what you're looking for. Because if somebody's participated 3 to 5 times or 5 more times, 5 or more times may be the highest that you care about in terms of how many times they've done something. So there are different approaches. You'll see this on our surveys and so on. There's also open-ended questions where you simply let the respondent give an answer. This is where they can do so in their own words. This has a number of challenges. We're working to do this better in the work that we're doing, because you can have a respondent who gives vast amounts of text or very little, depending on the respondent or interviewer. If you ask people, why do you do X, or what do you think about X, they may give you a paragraph, they may give you 2 words. So there are challenges between having how people respond. They can also be very difficult to analyze, because it is taking a lot of text, going through, trying to figure out what people are saying in that and how to put those into categories. They can also be challenging for the interviewer to record. An interviewer may struggle to keep up with the respondent and write it all out. So there are some issues here, but it is becoming far more viable with text analysis modeling using computer programs to be able to do this. So this is something we're exploring. If you're doing your own survey, I'd encourage you to explore, because there are some potentials here that could really help us better understand public opinion. So with non-attitudes, there is an issue too that people often, I've been asked to do surveys on things that people really don't have much an opinion about. And it's important to try and ensure, as you're doing your own work, you're not creating opinions. Then your respondents will answer a question, even if they have no opinion about it. We've asked in the past questions about certain legislation, certain bills that have been passed that simply don't exist. People give a response. So people are not necessarily knowing that they don't exist, because if you say, this bill of last year on gender, on criminalizing on sexual harassment, even if it doesn't exist, people say, well, I'm against sexual harassment, I'm for the bill. So it is important to know and understand how you're doing this, to know that people have some sense, or are likely to have a sense of what they're doing. If you are asking about something that people may not know about, you can provide additional details to help the respondent know about a topic. For instance, some people in the society say X, other people say that this is bad for Y reasons. What do you think? There are ways to try and help people get a sense of where they would fall if they had more information, or to encourage people to respond don't know to a question by simply saying, some people don't know the answer to this. Not everyone knows this. Do you have an opinion or do you not know? You can try and encourage that to make sure you're not picking up things that people really don't have an attitude on. And then there's also question ordering effects. You can think about the questions that you ask up front, or the topics will have an effect on what comes later. So in this case, if you start with the economy, for example, and then ask about political leadership, people may rate them more lowly if they're frustrated with the economy than they would if you start off with how do you rate political leaders and then move to the economy. So there is a sense of what's top of mind for respondents. What you've just made them think about does matter. This also matters in batteries. So if you ask first about, say, the president of the country and then other leaders, they may be judging them relative to the president because they first thought about the president and now they're trying to be consistent with how their ratings are. So if they give the president a 2, but they really hate Congress, they will give Congress a 1. But if they started with the president a 7, they may give Congress a 3. So there is a sense that people are trying to be consistent with their ratings across different questions. So you do need to think about how this order is and how it will affect. There's no perfect solution to this, but one of the things you can do is either try and put the topics in orders that will minimize this or potentially randomize. So potentially for some respondents, if you're using computer, start with Congress, others start with the president, and so on. And so you can randomize the order or the response order of the responses if you think this will have an effect there, to try to minimize this across respondents and get the true opinion of society overall. So this is a very, very common approach. And then let me close here briefly with fieldwork and beyond. If you are trying to do a survey yourself, it's nearly impossible to do a probability-based sample without assistance of a professional firm. The non-representative samples are possible to do, but non-probability entry-based surveys or some of the smaller surveys that we talked about before, you could potentially do purposive sampling, convenience sampling to get to do your own survey without a firm. If you want a more representative sample, the survey firm will provide the features, but at a pretty significant cost. And also, it is hard to do some of these things that they do for representative sampling without specialized coursework or knowledge. And so the best thing to do is to really work with the field team to oversee the field work, the data cleaning, the weighting, if you are choosing a representative sample. But even if you are doing that, one of the key pieces is to not just let the firm do its work, but to remain involved throughout, to make sure that you understand it, that you understand what's happening, that you're involved and really do understand that. Because as a researcher, you'll be asked all those questions, and that's one of the key pieces. The analysis of survey data falls that it's largely beyond the scope of this presentation, but it's important to understand how how weights work, for example, when to apply them, what it means. You may need to do other things like adapting for complex survey designs. There's ways to do that in programs. And it's important to ensure that results are not overreported. So these are all key pieces that you want to take into consideration as you go about it. So I will stop there for now. And so thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you. I'm happy to take questions.